Well, good morning. Ooh, there we go. Good morning. Okay, now let's stop this fellowship stuff. We don't want any of that going on here. What a terrible thing that is, isn't it? Yeah, they were. They were. And you go, hey, we saw that last week. And somebody said, you said, what is he yelling the army? Well, the reason I touched back on this just a little bit because of our, left side and right side of the viewing. That's all that means. At least in this context, that's all. This guy's this guy, and this guy's this one. You said it's just left and right. It made me feel sick. Well, thank you. Well, the reason I was touching back just a smidgen on this one that we, went on is because due to some of our excitement last week, we thought we just needed to touch a little bit on. Back on what our understanding of this. And so as we're in this part of the study, we've been going through what we called in other words, churches of Christ, as I believe probably all other groups have become so diverse in what they kind of think and understand, at least much more than had been at one time. And so there have been those that have tried to get in their head around it, to try to understand it, have come up with these kind of categories, if you will, that they've kind of identified. And remember, these categories should be viewed very loosely because there's such overlap, it's so, in other words, you just can't concrete it. And so it's just trying to be some understandings that can help us kind of focus a bit, but they're not something hard. And so as we looked at it, we looked at kind of traditionalism, we looked at grace-filled, we looked at evangelicalism and those effects, and then we were kind of got into this topic that I think is a very difficult topic, and to me is very difficult to get at least my head around, and for a number of reasons. We hear this topic often on the news, as we said, and often in a very negative light, and that may be due to the viewpoints of the news that is on there. But what this is this basic idea of this equating American values, purposes, all this kind of stuff with God's things, and we all understand that because we looked at things that way. Now, the big challenge and the question is that we say, hey, wait a minute. For those that are look at this and say, oh, all this. Well, isn't that just being a patriot? Isn't that can't you love your country? Things like that. And so, depending on who you talk to, some person will say, yeah, that's not what it means, and others say, yeah, it is what it means. And so, the whole purpose of this is just trying to kind of realize some of what's out there and what we're hearing. And so we looked at that and we saw some examples. We go, well, those certain political candidates are going into those places in our case, some of our schools, and talking, and so see that shows that they're that way. Well, there's been politicians that go into those that think otherwise, and nobody says things about those, and so it gets messy and inconsistent. But nonetheless, however, there is not just what would be called a Christian right. And I've talked to people before, and they've been really surprised at that. And part of that's been because they've listened often to sources where that point of view is the one always coming and not realizing that another is possible. And so where we ended last class was trying to look at some things that might be called the Christian left. And so one of the sources I went to was their website. And so this is part of this is where we got started. And so just getting a flavor of how they would define or view themselves. Welcome. Are you a Christian and a liberal? We are searching for you for 14 years. And I'm assuming that's when the website of the organization got up. I don't really know. If you're like many others, and by the way, the boldness in the letters, that was from their website. So I didn't just emphasize that. If you're like many others like us, you probably felt alone out there. You've probably been told you can't be a Christian and a liberal. And I've heard that before. I've had people say, I don't know how someone could be a Democrat and a Christian. And maybe some of us have heard that. Maybe some of us felt that. I have also heard the exact opposite. I don't know how someone can be a Republican and a Christian. Okay? And yet both are supposedly coming from the same source. Just, showing you how that is. And so you've probably been told you can't be a Christian liberal. You've probably been ostracized by churches and conservative Christian friends and family. You've probably doubted your own viewpoint at times. And these things have happened, depending on, where you're at and things such as that. And so as people, we sometimes get these ideas that that's, all the way it is, or because you're among a group that kind of thinks a whole lot alike, you think that's, and so on and so forth. And that may or may not be the case. That doesn't mean this is right or this is wrong. I'm just saying how these things happen. You're in the right place. Conservative Christians have turned their back on one of the central tenets of the Bible. Okay, so now they're making their case as to why they hold what they do and why they view that as not right. The tenet that Jesus said, the sum of the law and all the prophets, to love God and love your neighbor as you do yourself. And so they're claiming the golden rule, if you will, and they're saying, you're not doing it, and we are. And who is your neighbor? Jesus taught us it was a stranger of a foreign belief system who stopped to help another stranger beat up and left for dead on the roadside while religious types passed him by, obviously referring to the Good Samaritan. And we know the divide between the Jews and the Samaritans, and so that was shocking that the Samaritan would do that to the Jew. And so the Bible is full of instructions that this teaching isn't just for individuals. It's a universal teaching. It applies to individuals, governments, and businesses. And probably as a whole, we wouldn't necessarily disagree with the understanding of that passage per se. Welcome home. You have found your tribe. Conservative Christians are wrong. And you've been right all along. So often it's really interesting when we focus on things, we point out so much focusing on what's wrong with the other, and then we don't see we're doing the same thing. And that's why Jesus said, hey, before you take the speck out, better take the plank out. And it goes both ways. And so in my view, we kind of see some of that attitude happening here. We also welcome anyone who wants to be here. We have many, many friends who support our message of taking care of our brothers and sisters in this world, all of them. And of course, what's one of the things that they're addressing? And we've had, used to be somebody came in with the wrong haircut, all that kind of stuff. And I was talking about those things in the Bible, the clothes and what they wear. And so, and we know this has been so. I know I've struggled with those things, and so that's kind of what it's dressing. But sometimes they do the whole cloth or whole, broad brush. We are the Christian left. We're all around you. We're among the people. Take a look. We're part of the body of the Christ. We're Christians. We're liberal, and we make no apologies. In fact, Jesus' ways are liberal. That's why he was killed. And as soon as the temple incident happened and Jesus meddled in the business of the money changers, a target was placed on his back. And so here they're using this and claiming association with Jesus as everybody likes to do, right? And that gives credence to whatever, positions. Well, they're also doing it. And so it's just interesting to me. We're not New Age, okay? We're not waiting for some earthly leader to come and make everything all right. That man has already came. When he comes back, there's no doubt who he is. Everyone without exception will know. Until then, we are part of the body of Christ. We're not communists or Marxist either. We reject all such labels. We will not be profiled or pigeonholed and will not be quiet. We are Christians, we're liberals. Please get used to it. Thank you. And so, just getting an idea what this is. But, one can read things in the other directions depending on what one focuses on or prioritizes, how they interpret things. And so we see this difficult thing, I think. I'm trying to, how do things come together? Well, when you got very opposite views. Now, we're going to that standard of academic integrity, Wikipedia. Just joking there. But I found on it some things that I think, kind of also help to fill some of this out. And so the Christian left is a term originating in the United States used to describe a spectrum of left-wing political and social movements, Christian political and social movements, which largely embrace social justice. And of course, social justice is a term that we've been hearing certainly since the 60s, and not without foundation, and then of course of more recent times, the last 10 years or so. And so the concern is the righting of these societal wrongs, and not that there aren't societal wrongs. And so there's those that under that cloak of that. The most common religious viewpoint, which might be described as left-wing, is social justice or care for the poor and the oppressed. Supporters of this might encourage universal health care, welfare provision, subsidized education, foreign aid, affirmative action for improving the conditions of the disadvantaged. And stemming from an egalitarian values and what Jesus himself had said, adherents of the left consider it part of their religious duty to take actions on behalf of the oppressed. And so there are those, though not all that think that way would call themselves Christian or would be having that motivation, they're viewing as these righting these societal wrongs. And that's what was behind the social gospel we talked about in the 19th and early 20th century, and what ended up developing into Social Security and Medicare and things. Those were roots of that. Those are the beginnings of those, and things that are standard now that we rely on, and so on and so forth. And so again, that motivation of I'm doing what God said, at least for them, is very powerful as they've looked at these things. Now, the Christian left holds that social justice, renunciation of power, humility, forgiveness, and private observation of prayer, as opposed to publicly mandated prayer. So these would be those of saying that you shouldn't pray in a public school, though that doesn't mean everybody like this would advocate that, as we've well learned. There's always that spectrum. But that was a big tenet. They said, pray on your own, pray out there. Don't come in here and do it for whatever reasons. Are mandated by the gospel. Matthew 6, 5 and 6. The Bible contains accounts of Jesus repeatedly advocating for the poor and the outcasts over the wealthy, the powerful, and the religious. And of course, we're not unacquainted with those. The Christian left maintains that such a stance is relevant and important, adhering to the standard of turning the other cheek, which they believe supersedes the Old Testament law of eye for an eye. And the Christian left often hearkens toward pacifism in opposition to policies advancing militarism. And of course, we saw in the 60s those things. Now again, whether that was all Christian-oriented or not, there were those that felt strongly about those things. And so, as we look at this, one can look at it from one perspective. Well, is there politics informing their Christianity, or is there Christianity informing their politics? I don't know the answer to that. Maybe some of both, like it does everybody. We're not immune from that, no matter where we're at. While non-religious socialists find support for socialism in the Gospels, for example, Gorbachev cited Jesus as the first socialist, and over in Europe, they have a Christian Socialist Party, in some or all that's over there. And those that are taking what they understand as these tenets of Christianity and trying to apply them to the society as a whole and make it that. And of course, there could be lots of discussion on those things, on whether that works, and you're getting almost back to the church-state situation, and so on and so forth. And so the Christian left does not find that socialism alone is an adequate end and means. Christian faith is the core of the belief, which in turn demands social justice. And so in the whole spectrum of things, I think, as maybe we've seen, sometimes these important concerns have been ignored by some when maybe they should have more attention to them, and then it goes the other way. And it's just a real bag. Now, I put this passage in Leviticus in here because if you've been on Facebook, certainly in the last number of months, I've seen people that I know post this. And this is a passage in Leviticus where it's written, "When a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt, and I am the Lord your God." And we've all heard that before. And why was that in there? Because he's saying, God's telling them, hey, you remember how you were. You need to treat others. Well, this has been taken and used now in the immigration debate that's gone on. And for those, at least the ones I've seen, they keep emphasizing this as if this is why everything that the current administration is trying to do is all wrong, because you're not doing this. And of course, in one sense, one could, okay, but as you get deeper into those things, there might be greater questions. Does that mean any and everybody? Does that mean no matter what's been done, or so? And it can get really complicated, and because it is. And so I just wanted to show this because probably some of you have seen people posting this. Not saying they shouldn't, not saying we shouldn't think about these things, but nonetheless. The Christian left sometimes differs from other Christian political groups on issues including homosexuality. Now, the LGBTQ things have, in probably the last 10 years especially, has gotten very strong, partly because when same-sex marriage got approved, codified, legal, however you want to say that really was a major shift and turn in a lot of things. And so Jerry Jones has done a lot of study and work on things pertaining to this, and he's one that would say this is the issue because of a number of things, and that is, I remember his statement is, if we discard the authority of the Scripture, then he says it's all lost. You know, what is there? And again, that's very simplistic sounding and very complex, but nonetheless, but this issue is huge. And so this is often not a matter of different religious ideas, but one of focus. Viewing the prohibitions against killing or the criticism of concentration of wealth as far more important than social issues emphasized by the religious right, such as opposition to active homosexuality. In this case, similar to philosophies expressed by writers such as C.S. Lewis, these members of the Christian left believe homosexual sex to be overemphasized when compared with issues relating to social justice or even issues of sexual morality involving heterosexual. And so what is that talking about? Well, there are those who would say, wait a minute, you are really overemphasizing that. In other words, we have often heard much talk against homosexual practices, and we could cite many scriptures and so on and so forth. Well, there was those that would say, okay, but what about, how come in this list that Paul makes here, do we focus on that one and kind of ignore the rest of these? Or at least don't put the emphasis on it. That's what some of that argument is. And with some justification. In other words, we've said, all sin, and yet we focus on certain ones, views on either side of that. And so, challenging things. The Christian left doesn't get uptight about the same things. Remember, this is what they're writing. As their right-wing brothers and sisters, lefties tend to accept that we're all trapped in the human condition, which is true, that we all struggle and we're all sinners. I don't think any of us would disagree with that. They tend to focus on behaviors that Jesus focused on while he was here in the body, things like hypocrisy, organized oppression, exorbitant greed, self-righteousness, judgmentalism, selfishness, and abuse of power, violence, etc. And that's part of that list. And so you got some that are focusing on this and some that say, let's focus on this. And so, why is that? We can say, well, let's focus on, all of it. Well, we all say that, but that's harder to do than we sometimes want to admit. And so this is why this is so difficult and polarizing. I remember years ago when I was teaching, we had a club at Parkway North, as other schools did, and I don't remember the name of it, I really don't, where they put a piece of tape over their mouth and it'd be like Silence Day, and they would go around and want to talk about these things in the classroom, and that's what they're doing. And so we had what was called like homeroom rather than for a period of the day. And I got to tell you, I said no. I had one of my students in there ask, no, I really struggle with that. But then I also had a chance to talk to him. I said, listen, because I don't feel strong about them coming in to talk about this, however variant it was, I said, that doesn't mean that I'm going to put somebody in chains and pull them behind a pickup truck, because that stuff was going on too. I said, that's evil and terrible. Well, to what, and this is how we get as people, there's so much into this, they think that, well, the only other response is that. And so, and we also had the Westboro Baptist Church, do you all remember what that name was? That was a church in Kansas that would go around protesting against the government, against places or anything if they perceived that they were supportive of any of the homosexual agenda, as that's why God is, cursing us and we're not being blessed and so on and so forth. I didn't support that. Not that I thought all of this or something, but treating people that way and acting that horrible and ugly. What about where it's saying love your people? They're saying we are. We're being, well, no, you're not. and so it gets complicated. Bill. I believe they were. And again, to me, all that did is, first of all, that alienated any chance of bringing together and convincing. That kind of stuff doesn't do it. If somebody's yelling and screaming in your face, you're probably not likely to listen to them. And in whatever it is. Even if you agree on the topic, you are taken aback. And so these are these things that go on. But so there's those that view these things very liberal. Well, or excuse me. And so often these things are viewed in politics, because those that are generally deemed liberal tend to think more like that, and those that are deemed more conservative, all tend to think more like this. And so we view Christianity through that lens a lot, and it can get very confusing. And again, I think we've all struggled with that, however we've tried not to. Countless Christians today carry around a laundry list of conscious and unconscious expectations for themselves and others. This viewpoint generates what some have called a toxic shame. And again, that's kind of a loaded phrase, depending on who you are and who's saying it. One person's toxic is another person's, and so on. This viewpoint generates toxic shame and drains everyone of true spiritual strength. The Christian left focuses on a message to help people recognize the lies that keep them on the nonstop treadmill of feeling inadequate. In other words, it's dealing with, as they're viewing it, caring about someone as a person. And that's important, and that is important. There's no question about it, but it gets down to there's almost this exclusive feeling that we're the only ones doing it and they aren't. As remember, Shane preached, and we've mentioned many times, about categorize. Satan wants to categorize, put us into groups, and do all, and it works both ways. And so the Christian left focus on the message to help people. Remember, this is their writing. And keeping them on that nonstop treadmill of feeling inadequate, a message to help people discover the liberation of the gospel, the grace of Christ, and the rest that comes from what Christ has done on the cross. Salvation is a free gift. It cannot be earned. Nevertheless, grace isn't cheap, and after what Jesus has done for us, we offer our best to live up to what he asks from us to follow his commandments. And so what you got is those over here feel they're trying to live up to the gospel, and those over here say we're trying to live up to the gospel. And yet, in ways we look at, those are other ends of the spectrum. How can that be? It's complicated, very, very complicated. So this is a little bit of the flavor of what some of this is. Now, those that are on the Christian left would love to be the ones in power so they could implement all this, the things that they often accuse the Christian right of doing. And so it's like, wait a minute. And so anyhow, just a complicated subject. And so we didn't solve anything here, but just trying to be aware of this. And there are those that are very steeped in either side of this. In ways, I would say in ways, and I say that is, they both have points. And so I'm not trying to weasel out of an answer. I just really think of that. Trying to understand things. Yes. Yes. Uh-huh. Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yep. I agree. Yeah. 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 So what Ken's saying is that the real problem is that, as we've seen, everybody's shouting and nobody listens to each other. So you can't even consider. And for whatever reason, won't listen to each other. And it can be a myriad of reasons. Uh, and so and so we need to at least try to listen and you know, talk and try to understand. And then we also probably need to be able to realize that we may not, that all coming together on this, because we've seen historically that's never going to happen. No, you know, unity is not conformity. Unity is accepting these other things. Now, again, that doesn't mean that one's advocating that or supporting that or whatever, but then we don't have to break the other commands of being vicious and horrible and hateful and, you know, in response, which often is what wells up in us, and we kind of do in whatever way, shape, or form. And so, you know, the ends doesn't justify the means, or the purpose doesn't justify the particular response or passion. And I find it very complicated. And but anyhow, so this is a topic that we've heard of and is big, and there are those that are in our fellowship. And so what do? Well, in some places, depending on where you're at, you shouldn't be here. You should be gone. You should be out of here. And some don't feel welcome, and some are run out. And it can go either direction. And so is that what we're to be? You know, that's why, you know, there have been those that said we ought to be taking positions up here on these kind of things. You know, that'll... yeah. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, to me, it's better this way rather than, you know, those kind of things as one deals with it. And there'll be those that would disagree with that. Now, that doesn't mean that one condones or accepts or whatever, but how to, you know, if we take such hard positions, whatever that is, then because of that, you may never listen to anything I got to say about Christ because you're so offended by that, even though I feel very strongly about it. And so, you know, that's why I think that doesn't mean that we ignore the 800-pound elephant that's out there, or gorilla, or whatever the large creature is. And so this is very difficult. Anyhow, let us move on from that unpleasant topic, but nonetheless. Now, neo-apocalypse. Yes, Michelle. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yes. Yes. No, so she said, the sad thing is that we've often run, and we have. And we all know that. And by we, I don't mean just talking, and not just our fellowship, that this kind of divide. And so Jesus would come in and say, I think, what's going on here? What does it mean to love your neighbor? Love God, love your neighbor. Someone I was up in Kirksville this weekend. which is where Donnie and I became Christians in the campus ministry up there, visiting people from 40 years ago. And I was also up in Iowa visiting another group of friends from there also. And part of my reason in going was for me, but what that was I was trying to figure out how over these 40 years, how we all got from this to where we're at now. And meaning in our lives, in our personal journeys and things. And to me, what was really interesting, at least as far as, and again, I'm talking from this very personal point of view, the few that are left from 40 years ago, we kind of reconnected through something else. I mean, related, but we kind of, and I wanted to know, how did you get from here to here? I know how I got from here to here, and I was just very interested in that. And this one sister said, it's kind of summing up a lot of this, because we're talking about how do you do these things, and she said, love the one in front of you. Well, that's kind of boiled down. What does that mean? Love the one in front of you when they're in front of you. What does that mean? Well, that's a whole other topic and discussion, but boils down, rather than this, and this, and that understanding, was taking them where they're at and trying to work together and all those things. Now, I know that's very abstract, but nonetheless, I found it very interesting. So these things are happening all over. These things are happening all over. Not just our fellowship. These things are happening. Okay, now, neo-apocalypticism. Remember what apocalypticism is that we've talked about much over time. David Lipscomb, Warren Stone held that, and that was the idea that we're in the kingdom of God. This world is not our home. We shouldn't have much to do with the world. At one time, don't vote, pacifism, all these things. The world is going to be destroyed. Daniel, in Daniel, the rock that came down from heaven and destroyed, and all this. Okay, and that view is very prominent, we said, and at least in our fellowship, in the late 19th and by the end of the two world wars, that understanding wasn't totally gone, but it was just this from when it had been much larger. And we've covered some of that kind of stuff. If Christian nationalism represented one end of the political spectrum, meaning a very gung-ho embracing of politics and all these kind of things, where Christianity and a nation were melded together, and at the opposite end was neo-apocalypticism. And I've been saying in this class a lot that this understanding has been re-emerging in this century. Among our fellowship. Neo-apocalypticism rejected this idea of Christian nationalism as was defined. A small but influential movement critically appropriated the Stone, Lipscomb, Harding apocalyptic worldview. In other words, there were those, and some of that was academia, was kind of taking those ideas and writing books and kind of saying, hey, maybe we need to relook at this concept. Building on a recovery of historical consciousness in the 80s and 90s, this group advanced allegiance to the kingdom of God rather than kingdoms of the world. And so those influenced by this tradition included the wide range of people from urban ministers to large congregations, university professors, people in the pews. Neo-apocalyptic leaders were rooted in the grace tradition, as were those influenced by evangelicalism. But neo-apocalyptic leaders fiercely rejected evangelicalism's attempts to Christianize the culture. In other words, remember what's behind some of that, and that is the belief, and we understand this because many of us have thought and believe this, is that, hey, if we can just put all the Christian principles into use in the government, everything will be better. And while on one level it's like, yeah, but in reality that generally hasn't worked out very well. And they thought that with the church and state back in Europe and all those other centuries, you know, and things like that. And remember, that's why when Campbell and them came over here, it was deeply embedded into them this idea of not having that, and that congregations are autonomous and all that. That comes from those backgrounds. Yes, Bill.
Yes, if there was really truly valued Christian procedures involved, it wouldn't be like it turned out in Europe. Don't forget that. In other words, if Christ was really running this,
Sure.
or somebody is trying to emulate Christ and his
Yeah.
walk, you wouldn't have had that European difficulty that brought him over here.
And often,
That's a
everybody trying to renew that thinks the same. We'll do it right.
yeah.
We'll do it right. I'm just saying that often that would be the counter to some of that. Is that, wait a minute, you've tried it here, and how's that turned out? I'm just, you know, just like those that advocate socialism. They think, oh, like the guy running in New York that we keep hearing, you know, the mayor. You know, you're going to say, you know, that all sounds real good, but it hasn't really worked very well. And then when, if you kind of question it, then they come at you with the authorities and the law and the guns and all this stuff. And so what would be what the argument is. And so that was just my point. I'm not saying I think that's terrible. I just think it hasn't worked doing it top down as opposed from bottom up, I think is what it means. But neo-apocalyptic leaders fiercely rejected evangelicalism's attempts to Christianize the culture or baptize a political party, meaning, you know, remember what the moral majority was back in the 80s. Okay, that tended to be more Republican, certainly and so that's what that means. And even as some adopted other aspects of evangelicalism. So this is Lee Camp, and he's a professor down at Lipscomb. And he wrote this book, I think about 10 or 15 years ago, it's been around, Mere Discipleship. And what it is it's examining a lot of things through this this apocalyptic view that Lipscomb had. And it's very fascinating. It's really interesting. And so I just want to show you that. Well, we got to end here. And so I thank you for that, and we will continue on next week. Anything else? Thank you.